Nos encontramos iniciando el día 2 de Merelec ProCom Digital Week. Esta jornada la dedicaremos a hablar sobre optimización, un término atractivo para cualquier industria, pero ¿cómo podemos explotarlo? Los modelos de optimización matemática nos ayudan a abordar decisiones de negocios difíciles, permiten a las empresas resolver problemas comerciales complejos y tomar decisiones óptimas que mejoren su eficiencia. Sin más preámbulos, demos inicio.
La digitalización de la energía está transformando nuestra realidad a un paso acelerado. Descubre cómo la optimización y la generación de pronósticos ofrecen soluciones a los grandes retos de la industria energética en el evento Merelec ProCom Digital Week. 3 días para discutir soluciones de alto impacto económico con un equipo de expertos de Europa y Latinoamérica. Este 24, 25 y 26 de noviembre te esperamos en Merelec ProCom Digital Week, el futuro de la energía en Latinoamérica hoy.
Las empresas del sector energético deben considerar docenas, cientos o a veces miles de factores para tomar decisiones. Para ello, deben considerar variables y restricciones propias del mercado en el que operan. La primera conferencia de hoy busca abrir la ventana a este interesante panorama. Se trata de soluciones digitales para estudios de factibilidad y planificación de inversiones en proyectos de energía. Conozcamos a nuestro ponente. Esta primera conferencia será el punto de partida para hablar sobre modelos de optimización de activos energéticos. Damos inicio. Adelante, Richard.
Buenos días and hello. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you to the second day of our conference, The Energy Future in Latin America Now. It's an honor for me to open today's topic, optimization, with my lecture for you about digital solutions for feasibility studies and investment planning for energy projects. My name is Richard Plum. I work as the product manager for consulting at ProCom, and I'm responsible for the international business. Just let me have some words on ProCom. We are the market leader for optimization, forecasting, and trading in Europe. That means that 60 gigawatt of the power and heat generation of Europe is daily planned, optimized, and traded with our software. 50 million people benefit from our solutions. We are proud to say that also the 4 of the 5 largest German cities use our solutions, and our customers can have up to 50% increase in earnings also by using our optimization, forecasting, and trading solutions. Just to give you a small overview, a little selection of our customers, you can see our customers like utilities, power and trading companies, grid and system operators, as well as industry. Some of them you will be familiar with, like BASF, BMW, or the big trading companies like E.ON or Vattenfall, and also German Stadtwerke, municipals like Stadtwerke Düsseldorf or BS Energy. And now I would like to say welcome to the future. Welcome to my presentation about feasibility studies and investment planning for energy projects with digital solutions. And I can tell you, success can be prepared. Every day we have to take decisions, and these decisions have to be made along the value chain. From generation up to storage, trading, transmission, to sales and demand control. We take decisions on new business ideas, on new assets like renewable energy sources, power plants, storages, the grids, and their system integration. We have to decide on new portfolios or the compositions of them. Do we have to talk about expansion, conversion, or dismantling of assets? Talk about technology concepts, trading and sales strategies, sustainability, CO2 footprints, and of course the decarbonization topic. And finally, also take and make management and organization decisions. And feasibility studies and investment planning support us. They support us to have the right recommendations for our decisions. These recommendations can be found by feasibility studies and by investment planning, as you can see. What do these two types of support mean? Well, feasibility studies are about the technical feasibility, the resources and availability of people, machines, space, material, and time. It's about the timely implementation, taking into account also legal and regulatory framework, the organizational implementation, and the economic feasibility, talking about the cost framework and the financing. The investment planning is more or less an add-on, or in other words, it's based on the feasibility studies. It's about the investment costs, takes into account the cash flow plan, taking into account operating costs, the financing of equity and debt capital, the revenues, tax consideration and depreciation, the provisions, and finally the risk assessment. The investment planning, or so to say the business plan, includes all procedures that allow a rational assessment of the aspects of an investment. To this end, the financial consequences of an investment are to be quantified and condensed in order to provide a recommendation for a decision. And the standardization of energy economic evaluations is a means of choice. Whether feasibility study or investment planning, in order to ensure quality, comparability, and speed, it's advisable to apply standardized methods and procedures. Through standardization, these evaluations can largely be digitized and thus automated. And the standards have to be implemented in the target definition, in the methods, in the evaluation itself, and of course in the way how to report it. So let's have a closer look on the energy economic evaluations that has to be digital and standardized again to ensure quality, comparability, and speed. What do we need for that? We need forecasts, digital models, and optimization. And it's always important to distinguish for the input data. Ex post analysis are based on historical input variables. However, forecasts are more meaningful for an investment assessment. Forecasts as input variables that describe the future make it possible to evaluate the future. What you see here is the easiest way or the easiest basis for digital evaluations. So you have different input values, you have relations in between these values, you calculate these relations and get output values on a very low complexity. The relations are calculated. The next step is a little bit more complex, but also gives you more significant output. You use input values and digital models. And these models are simulated for the digital evaluation. So what is a model? In other words, what is a digital twin? A digital model describes a tangible or intangible process or object from the real world with mathematical formulas. That means the idea of a business model or an asset or a portfolio are put into a digital model, taking into account input values like prices, costs, markets, new market design, new setups. You simulate the model and get output values like costs for the next year, for the next 10 years, for the next week, also revenues on markets, also plans how to control the assets, when assets maybe will produce energy, when storages will be loaded with energy. All this can be part of a digital model from the real world to help to evaluate the business model, the revenues, the outcome, whatever you want from the simulation model. The highest complexity also takes into account forecasts, not only simple input values. And it's not only a simulation, it's an optimization of the models. Better to call it a techno-economical optimization. Within the scope of the optimization, from a large number of different ways in which a model can behave, the economically best one is selected, taking into account the input data and constraints. This leads to the best result in terms of energy economics and thus shows, for example, the realistic potential of an investment, of a business idea, of a new asset configuration. So you see, the more complex your models, your input data gets, the more significance you have in the output values. Let's start with an easy example. The power storage unit, the battery, and how to model it. This is a typical battery storage of the energy industry. And like in optimization or simulation software, you can configure the battery like what's the maximum power input, what's the maximum power output, the minimum and maximum content. You can also add time-dependent minimum content, time-dependent maximum content. You have loading losses, unloading losses, fixed storage loss rate, and also you could configure some loading limitations. This is about modeling the battery. Maybe for an investment calculation, should I use a battery to add to complete my portfolio or not? But this is only about modeling the battery. The environment around the battery that is also responsible for the business case, for the costs, for the revenues, has also been taken into account. So to put this in the optimization context, you now see that the battery storage, on the one hand, will somehow be loaded for this example, by a wind farm and by a photovoltaic plant. And of course, the electricity, the power that is stored in the battery, will be sold to a day-ahead market. So you see, the whole system will be optimized. And what are the input values? The input values, of course, were the configuration constraints you saw in the slides before. But what is the input of the wind farm and of the photovoltaic plant? That's electricity, depending on the weather, depending on outer effects. And for this, we need forecasts, because we cannot easily somehow model or calculate the generation without a forecast of the weather, and this forecast of the weather will be transferred into a forecast of the generation of the wind farm and of the photovoltaic plant. And for this, we also need digital models. And also, for the day-ahead market, we need a forecast or somehow an idea of the price. What is the price at which hour? That means for which product, market product, like hourly product, daily product, space load, peak load, what is the price? And how to get this price? Will we have an optimization for energy economic evaluation of the history to have an ex-post analysis? Or do we want to know what will be the revenue of this system maybe in the next week, in the next month, in the next years? So for this, we need other input values and also forecasts. And because of the complexity of this system, and when you model this and make the model and the optimization work, of course, you get very trustful output values like what's the revenue for the time period I'm looking at, and also what is the generation of the wind farm, of the photovoltaic plant, what is the storage plan, the loading plan, unloading plan of the battery, does it make sense? All this information you get. So now let's talk about general conditions and input data of energy economic evaluations, having in mind the little example I showed you before. First of all, let's have a look at general conditions and input data in sense of the evaluation period. I already mentioned it. At which time frame do we want to look? Is it ex post to see what a new invest, what an actual portfolio, what a grid, what a business idea would have brought in the past? Like what would have been the revenues, the wins, the losses in 2018 to 2020? Or do we want to have an idea of what will be in the next 5 years or in the next 10 years as a support for decision for an investment? The definition of the evaluation period, is it short-term or long-term, is usually done in the business plan, especially for evaluations of new investments. And typically there is a market standard for the definition of time intervals in calendar years. So if we talk about short-term, it's always the current year, like 2020, up to 3 years in the future, up to 2023. Medium term means 2024 up to 2025. And long term is from this year on plus 6 years up to 35 years. So long term would really be, for example, for an investment, for a big investment like a wind farm or a power plant or a big heat storage, to see really what are the conditions, what is the wins, what are the wins and losses, what is the revenue and the return on invest of this project for the next 35 years. And this really helps, informations like this help to say, okay, let's do this investment, or no, we will lose money with it, let's not invest in it. And there's also one special point for the energy business, and it's the consideration of the different types of year according to the object of evaluation. So if it's a normal asset, we're talking about calendar years. If it's in the gas business, we have special gas business years. So starting in October up to the next year by the end of September. And also the water business year, it's also a market standard, is about to evaluate the periods starting from November of one year to the end of October of the next year. Now let's have a closer look on the databases. First of all, very important also to make all the analysis and the outcome to make it comparable, and also that it's right. You need a common key date, so-called quotation date, or a range of validity that applies to all input data, so that I'm not combining maybe electricity prices from today for the next 5 years with gas prices of January 2020 for the next 5 years, because then that the outcome of your evaluation will not make any sense. The next point to do is have a definition of the database periods for commodity prices. Where to get them? Typically for short term, you take current market prices from the liquid future market or from the spot market. Again, ex post, when we say, okay, let's evaluate with the quotation date of last month, or maybe of January 2020, or say, okay, we do the evaluation today and we want the quotation date for all the input data today. Sometimes there are special market situations where it makes sense not to use today as quotation date, maybe because there is something crazy going on and the market quotation date is more realistic to say, okay, let's take the quotation date from June 2020 or even earlier. Especially taking into account the actual Corona situation, where we had different changes in the markets, in the short-term and long-term markets as well, where you really can see different when you evaluated a special investment project idea, whatever, at the beginning of the year, and now you would take the same input data just with another quotation date, maybe of April. There is a total different outcome of the evaluation. And that's of course because the market situation changed. So that's just one side comment about the quotation date. Coming back to the different terms, we had short term. What are the right market prices and input data for medium term? Typically, you use an interpolation of the input data between short and long-term period. And you interpolate the input data, not the optimization results or the calculated revenues, because you have to adapt the input and not the output. The output is still the outcome of an optimization. And the third period is the long-term period, where you typically take data from long-term market analysis, for example, fundamental market analysis, because the markets, even the future markets, are not that liquid to have realistic prices for the next 35 years. So you somehow need so-called fundamental market analysis to have an idea of what would be the price in the next 20, 25, 30, 35 years. Also some comments on the databases for commodity prices. Particularly in the case of a price time series, you have to take care to ensure that the associated units are used correctly, because there are typical sources of errors, especially when you want to digitize and automate the process. Once you have these errors, you maybe will not find them for a long time. So take care that maybe when you talk about oil, is it dollar per barrel crude oil or is it dollar per ton gas oil? When you have prices also as input, always in energy economic evaluations, what's the currency? What's the exchange rate? And once again, the quotation date. If you use prices of the market of today, but the prices are in dollar and I want to have them in euros, and then I take the exchange rate of yesterday or of last month, then I have a source of error, because the exchange rate quotation date is not the same as the quotation date of the price. Finally, you also have to define the related markets and exchanges for prices, commodities. Where do you want to buy it? What are the markets you're going to use? Makes no sense when you see good prices in markets that you will not use for the investment, for the idea. Now let's have a closer look on the input data of prices and forecasts. What about the databases for commodity prices? The time resolution of commodity prices varies depending on the product, valuation period, and procurement strategy. Is it a purchase contract, or do I buy the commodity directly via spot term trading? So the time resolution can change between annual, semi-annual, quarterly, daily, hourly, and quarter-hourly products and steps. Fuel supply contracts are to be modeled according to their contractual framework. In addition to the prices, any fuel quantity restriction, of course, must be taken into account. And when you put commodity prices, or you have them as a basis in your evaluation, you have to decide whether to take current wholesale market prices, for example, the future market. Are they realistic? Is the market liquid enough for the delivery period you're looking at? Or do we need price forecasts for this? Or do we have to take, as I mentioned before, fundamental market analysis prices? We also have surcharges on commodity prices, so-called structure costs, transporting costs, trading fees for buying commodities on exchanges. That means asset-specific surcharges are part of the input data. You get the information from the operator or project manager. And depending on your model, they are part of the marginal costs. As well, of course, you need generation forecasts for the non-controllable renewable energy sources, like wind, photovoltaic, because there you don't have any commodity price as well. You get them for free, besides the investment of the technology. You don't have marginal costs, but at least you know what's the actual generation, the generation of tomorrow for the next year, for the next 10, 20 years. And you also need load forecasts for non-controllable loads, such as power demand, heating, cooling demand, and also the generation of industrial goods when you optimize and evaluate maybe an industry plant or an industrial site where industrial goods are produced. Also, the different trading opportunities you have and you want to use determine the choice of the input power prices. As you can see, the different possibilities we, for example, have in Germany. We have the power market, but there we not only have the wholesale energy only market, we also can make money with ancillary services. You get money for special interventions of the TSOs, like for redispatching, feed-in management, or shutdown interdictions. But due to their characteristics, like liquidity, standardized, and no counterparty default risk, it's always useful to compare or evaluate on the basis of exchange products and prices, because exchanges have the spot market, day ahead and intraday, and the forward market, where they have futures and options. That means you already have short-term and medium-term on these markets, and also the standardized products and prices for them. Then different options can be compared in your evaluation. Do I want to evaluate a singular trading today ahead, control energy, or intraday market according to the qualification of my individual asset? Or do I want to have an evaluation of a combined trading, for example, on the day ahead and intraday market combined? Is that possible? Do I want this information? Finally, we also have to take into account, especially for long-term evaluations, the non-availability of assets. We have the so-called planned non-availabilities, and we have the so-called unplanned non-availabilities. What means planned? Planned or known availability, the most important one are the maintenance, the revisions of the assets. For every type of asset, you have technology-specific maintenance patterns. When does it start over the year? How long does it typically will take place? And you have to roll out these technology-specific maintenance patterns for the entire evaluation period. They are fixed input variables of the techno-economical optimization, because in the maintenance frames of an asset, you just can't use it. You can't produce energy with it if it's in maintenance. And for example, big power plants or big classical power plants, but also wind farms, windmills, once a year, they have to stand still because of the maintenance. You have to take this into account. But of course, we also have the unplanned non-availabilities. You find information on these types in technical literature. And they are taken into account by deducting them from the revenues and the economic evaluation. So there are no input variables for the techno-economical optimization, as they are just statistic values, because in an optimization and simulation, we could say, okay, we will have a rule that somehow at one point there will be an unplanned non-availability, but better and more realistic is to say, okay, we have statistic values like 5%, 3% of a year, this asset will not run because of an unplanned accident. So we will deduct this from the revenues in the evaluation itself. As we had a view on the different general conditions and input data, we see that it also has to be seen as an organizational process. We have to ensure that the input data is up to date, is fixed to the correct quotation date, and of course the data itself has to be correct and error-free before we can start the process of the energy economic evaluation. That means technical parameters like power change gradient or storage volume must be up to date. The input data should be error-free, especially time series, no gaps, no incorrect values, and of course they also have to be up to date, and the forecasts have to be checked in advance for quality, and if necessary, they have to be retrained. That means we're talking about an energy data management system. And this system should be, and of course, can be digital and automated. For this, you also have to clarify some questions and points within the company to standardize everything. Who is responsible for the asset input parameters? Who is responsible for the price forecasting and ensures the availability and quality? Who are the recipients of this information? We need a distribution list, maybe inside of the company. Do we have fixed update events? Every renewal, every updating of the input parameters, maybe every 2 or 3 months, because then we want to recalculate our evaluation, our investment planning. Maybe the investment already started. Now we have to have a quality management to see if that what we calculated and decided on for the investment is still there, if it will still make money or not. Do we stick to the plan? So it always makes sense, once you had an automated evaluation of an idea, project, asset, whatever, you can do this for every 2-3 months, every year, to see what is the status quo and what was the ex post status quo when we started the project. Now let's really have a deep dive into an example and also have a look at the software. With that software, you can do techno-economical optimization and also use the results for your evaluation, and everything can be fully automated. So we have a look at a combined cycle power plant. First, as a standalone asset, as the first model, and also as the second model in combination with renewable generation and battery storage. Maybe we already have the CCGT, combined cycle power plant, and we want to figure out, does it make sense to install a battery storage as well as a wind farm or maybe photovoltaic generation to have more revenues on that asset. So for this, I now switch into the Bullfit software, where you can easily model and do these evaluations. Here you just see that we have modeled the CCGT. You have the different turbines, you have the fuel input, you have the generated power, you have the configuration of the asset, the fuel input regarding to the electrical power output, things like this, startup costs and startup ramp. And we also have the fuel input, like a take or pay contract, as well as fuel from Henry Hub. We also take into account the CO2 generation, and the produced power should be sold on one power node on the power market. For this, we calculated, better to say optimized, the generation regarding the prices, the power market prices, the fuel prices for 1 month in 2018 for the January, as you can see. And here you see the different information we have, maybe each generation per turbine, the total fuel consumption, the prices of the fuel, as well as the power price. And there you just see what is the generation of the different turbines, the ideal, perfect, optimized generation to produce energy regarding the costs and the prices on the market. To save time, I'll not explain every graph in detail, just for you to understand what is the outcome of a software like this. The second question is, okay, we have a special revenue on this. I'll come later back to the point revenue. Now let's see when we take this model and add some renewables. Here we have now photovoltaic generation and wind generation. We also have the battery of our example, and the feed in the input data of the optimization here are the historical generation data. So we don't need a forecast because it's ex post, and we can see, okay, what is the impact if we install also a photovoltaic park, a wind farm, and a battery into this portfolio. Once again, we're looking at January 2018, but now also the model and the optimization takes into account the photovoltaic generation as well as the wind generation. We see the loading and unloading of the battery. We again have the power price, the information when the model says, the optimization result says the best way to sell energy. Some points we also buy energy. And you see I can add also all the other information, the results and input data of the optimization to see, okay, these are now different information of the control of the optimized production of the combined cycle power plant, also taking into account the renewables generation, and using the battery in the most energy economic way. What we did is we had an ex post evaluation of January 2018. The model, and therefore the optimization, takes into account all costs, the fuel costs, startup costs, all this stuff, and it also takes into account all the possible profits of selling the generation to the power market. Outcome of these data, automatically analyzed in controlling software or Excel or whatever a company needs, is the CCGT as a standalone asset has earned exposed for this snapshot in time $8.81 million. If we put this in combination with the renewable generation and the battery storage, it would have earned $12.5 million. So you see, it would have made sense or still makes sense to add battery and renewable generation for this special asset. The next questions would be, what are the investment costs for the battery and the renewable energy system? And when does the investment for this start to pay off? So the next things would be, what needs to be done and what are the possibilities? All processes related to energy data management, optimization, and result evaluation can and should be automated today. The preparation of feasibility studies and based on this, investment planning for energy projects is thus simplified, faster, and cheaper. Errors are avoided and the quality and significance of the result increases enormously. And all this thanks to digitization. And at this point, I want to thank you. Thanks for your audience, and I'm looking forward to your questions now in our live Q&A sessions. Adios.